Tonight's event is sponsored in part by our friends at Brooklyn.org. It's an extension of their commitment to support a vibrant and thriving Brooklyn, and we are so honored by their investment in the Center for Fiction and tonight's event. So it's my pleasure to hand the mic over to Dr. Jocelyn Rainey. As president and CEO, Dr. Rainey has led Brooklyn.org in creating a more inclusive and accessible model for community philanthropy to marshal the resources required to end inequity in New York City's largest borough. Under Dr. Rainey's leadership, Brooklyn.org has surpassed $100 million in total giving and expanded its sector-leading commitments to racial justice and community engagement. We are so honored to have Brooklyn.org with us tonight. Dr. Rainey, thank you.
Thank you, Lida. Thank you. So we are really excited to welcome you here tonight. And I say we because some of our team is here as well, and we hope you get an opportunity to talk to them after the event. A little bit about Brooklyn.org. Brooklyn.org is a champion for our borough and the amazing nonprofit community we have here. Each year, our community helps power nearly $5 million in funding to local nonprofits working in every issue area in every neighborhood. And this mission feels even more important today as we face national upheaval and uncertainty. It's critical that we come together to care for each other right here, building strength and pushing for progress from the ground up. We are especially honored to be here tonight in partnership with the Center for Fiction, a vital cultural institution that has enriched our borough's literary landscape since 1821. Together, we're presenting this special program in conjunction with the 100th birthday of James Baldwin, a writer whose words continue to resonate deeply with our commitment to racial justice and also fostering connections and understanding across communities. I invite you all to please stay after the discussion for a reception that's hosted by Brooklyn.org, where we can share more about our unique mission for Brooklyn. So make sure that and it's kind of dark, so I don't know, but I want to make sure that you all get an opportunity to talk to our team that's here, but we also have board members in the audience as well that can talk more about our work and why our work is so important for, as you said, the largest borough with close to 3 million people who get so little of the resources that New York City gets. So it's really important, especially when we have thriving cultural institutions like these, that we want to make sure that we're doing our part to take care of as well. So thank you for being here tonight as we celebrate literature and legacy and our shared commitment to Brooklyn's future. So now I'm excited to introduce tonight's program, The Evidence of Things Unseen, Baldwin, Faith, and Fiction, featuring Yadan Israel, founder of the Literary Swag Book Club and senior editor at Simon & Schuster, and Robert Jones Jr., the New York Times bestselling author of The Prophets.
Oh, man.
I'm sure
Hello?
I could do this myself,
Hello?
but
Hello?
just
Hello?
wanted to
Oh,
say
it's.
that
How y'all doing?
in the
Can I get a
future-
good evening from everybody? One more time, good evening. This is my first time in all these years I've ever sat on this side. He pointed out there's a timer. I feel like I'm on PBS org raising money. Save Sesame Street. All right, good. How do I want to start this? So, give context. I love to give context because context provides stakes for what this conversation is about and why it matters. I've developed a relationship with the Center for Fiction through a friend, Randy Winston, who some of you know. And something I always think about is like, what does it mean to host things at a space? Like, so when the Center for Fiction reached out, about like, what can we do together to sort of advance the discourse around fiction as a framework, I thought about the way in which, as an editor at Simon & Schuster, but also as like just a cultural like purveyor and somebody who cares deeply about culture, I thought about what it meant to live in a culture that doesn't really know what fiction means. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is the notion that like, I've people will use the word novel interchangeable with memoir, essay interchangeable with short story. And it's funny, but the ramifications of it isn't. And here's what I mean by the dangers of those ramifications. And as an editor at Simon & Schuster, it's something I've learned. Even when I was a cultural critic, I would watch the way in which critics talked about the writings of Black and brown fiction writers as reality. It had to be rooted and based in reality. There was no imagination. But simultaneously, anytime works of fiction were written by non-Black and brown people, you see what I did there? I averted the critical gaze. I didn't say non-white. I flipped it. Right. So, but there's always this celebration of the imagination. Like, oh my God, look at this imagination. Look at the craft. Look at the rigor. Look at the labor. And it became very personal to me that anytime I saw that, what I looked at when I looked at Baldwin's legacy, I saw how, as a culture, as an international legacy, when we talk about Baldwin, and when I say we, I'm not indicting any singular person, I'm talking about a larger discourse. We engage with the essays, we engage with the speeches, but when it comes time to engage, not with his fiction, but what his imagination meant, there's not as much language, rich language, as there is about the essay. So in terms of honoring this 100th year, I wanted to have a specific conversation that engaged with Baldwin's imagination as a framework for faith of how you construct a different outcome for a future. And how do we look at fiction writers as being the people who conjure the language, who conjure the worlds that enable us to ask different kinds of questions about presence that feel like definite, right? That feel defined. And so when I thought about who would be the great conversation partner in this, I looked at my brother to the left who got this James Baldwin hoodie, who didn't tell me because I would have wore one if he would have told me he had a hoodie. But anybody who doesn't know, and like, there's ways in which people touch our lives before we even know who they are. And the way this man touched my life was he had a popular platform called Son of Baldwin, where he would just highlight all these different discourses around like the concerns of what it meant to be a Black artist. That's how I understood it. And I remember my first ever published essay about gentrification in Bed-Stuy. I told you about this. It got like retweeted on or posted on, I don't even know what the language is for Facebook in 2010, but whatever that was, that happened. And like getting replayed by Son of Baldwin is almost like getting played by Funk Flex in the 90s. It was like, oh, I made it. Because so many people who I wanted to get this essay, the challenge of being a writer at that time was like so much of the gatekeeping and trying to get your work to the readers you imagined, you had to go through all these people who imagined a different reader. And the different reader that was imagined meant different kinds of edits that alienated the person you was writing to. And so what you represented was you showed me it was possible to reach the people I was imagining when I was writing. And so when I think about your labor, before you published, you had The Prophets published, I thought that in the legacy of what Baldwin represents, there was no one else I wanted to have this conversation with besides you. So I want to open this discourse, this conversation with you being a fiction writer, being somebody who has a deep integrity, not just in imagination, but in the rigor of it, in the craft of it. Tell the people how you define imagination. We talked about it, but I want you to talk about it with them.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, imagination for me is not simply the opening up of possibility. It's not simply the dreaming of something new or of something old. It is, as Dr. Imani Perry would say, it is a conjuring in which you bring forth a kind of solution to an ailment. It's a kind of cure, to paraphrase Toni Morrison. It is the means by which I, as a Black queer writer, find a space in which I'm not necessarily safe, but I am seen. Where my humanity is not a question. It's not subject to question. It is inherent, so that whether I succeed or falter, none of that alters the kind of love I am worthy of receiving. Imagination starts then for me in a place of love and how do I make the world more grand, more inclusive, more loving, as opposed to how do I shrink it? How do I engage in the most selfish parts of myself without accountability? How do I make life miserable for others but beautiful for me? That's not imagination, that's sadism. And so for me, when I'm reading people like Baldwin, and by the way, we have this chair here because we invited this evening the spirit of Baldwin to come into this room. Yes. Shout out to the Center for Fiction for proposing this idea, which my brother Yadan said, oh, that's West African. Yes, we can absolutely do that. So when I read people like Baldwin, who is one of the most relentlessly intelligent beings I have ever come across, we focus on his intellect, but his intellect would not have been possible without his imagination.
Something I'll admit to this room, the irony, but, journey, growth. I did not like fiction growing up. And here's why I did not like it is because I was raised in a Black nationalist household where I was educated to interrogate and question everything about the society in which I live to be a fiction. And so I grew up internalizing this notion that fiction was dangerous, right? The fiction of the social construct of whiteness, the fiction of poverty, and I'm like, okay, so I don't want to necessarily engage with what is constructed. I want to try to figure out what's as close to real as possible, quote unquote. Okay. But then what happened is, in a lot of ways, a sort of like you go from one end of the spectrum to the other, and then I was reading no fiction, and something that, and like I'm indicting myself in this, was like for a long time, I did not know how to access my imagination in order to engage with Baldwin's. So when I read the novels, I could not envision an imagination without like, oh, this is all his life, right? This had to be based in immediate stakes. And I had a friend, and I'm always going to sing her praises in her name. Her name is Brittany James. I went to Pace University in New York City, and she was relentless in trying to get me to read Octavia Butler's Kindred. Oh. And for 3 weeks, that woman just chased me around. And she was like, Yadon, you gotta read this book. And you gotta think about, like, when you're 18 and someone nags at you for 3 weeks, that's like Monday through Thursday, every common hour, and you're in the calf. We used to do BSU together. She used to, Yadon. And I was like, girl, give me the book. And when I read the book, and I'm like, oh, like what I'm seeing in that book, or what I'm seeing was the labor that fiction was asking me to do, was ask certain questions about circumstances that had they not been imagined, I would have never thought to ask. Right? And so it's like when you make a world where somebody is teleported into the past because their ancestor is in trouble, but teleported back into the present when they're in trouble, it's like, what kind of world would that be? And so that imaginative framework, that curiosity is opening, and I'm asking questions, and I'm like, oh, that's what fiction is doing. Or that's how I understand fiction. Fiction, as I understand it, is a framework for curiosity. And to have a framework for curiosity then enables you to imagine, like, well, what if we were not poor? What if this didn't look like this? And from that question, you can begin to create another set of assumptions that you begin to build, right?
Yes. There is this assumption, to speak of those, Americans seem to think that fiction and lying are the same thing.
I was one of those Americans.
Like you, I grew up in a Black nationalist home, And if I was not reading the Quran or How to Eat to Live, then I was wasting my time.
There you go.
That's just basically how my family saw it. Because, as you said, there are so many, I don't want to call them fictions, I want to call them lies, because they are intentionally dishonest. Whereas fiction is telling you a story in a way that's sort of seductive, because what it's doing is it's saying, I want you to imagine that you are in the shoes of this person that you're reading about. And maybe this is not, these are not facts that have happened to this person, but I am attempting to grasp at some larger truth. So again, going back to Toni Morrison, even though this is Baldwin's day, she said fiction is not fact, but it is truth. And that is a distinction, a nuance that most Americans don't understand, particularly if you are an American who is being shaped under a particular kind of patriarchy.
Can you, for you, what's your language? How would you distinguish the language between fact and truth? And I want to, just answer that question first.
Okay. Fact. Slavery existed in this country for hundreds of years. Fiction, Samuel and Isaiah perhaps did not exist on that plantation in Mississippi. But everything that happened around them is true, because this is what would have happened if they existed on that plantation. And I get to say it in the most lyrical, beautiful, or lovely or tragic way as possible that doesn't necessarily fit under the category of fact. But it does, truth has more room for understanding. Because facts tell you things, but they don't tell you the circumstances. Slavery ended in 1865. Boom, that's a fact. But does that fact tell you that it really didn't end, and that the country found different ways to enact the same violences and thefts that it was doing beyond 1865? No. Right.
Okay, I like that. Incorporating your understanding of fact and truth, how does it inform? Wait, I want to go back to the thing you said, because I think this is a good way to open up the discourse about like just inviting not just Baldwin as a discourse, but like the influence, right? And so when we talk about Toni, we talk about Imani Perry, Dr. Imani Perry, excuse my language, right? That is talking about Baldwin, right? Like the whole quote that that Toni said at his memorial, your crown has already been bought and paid for. You just have to wear it. That notion of like, and to talk about these people is to talk about a massive influence. And like the thing me and Robert laughed about is like, if you want to understand imagination from a humorous standpoint, where is James Baldwin from? Okay, this is the 100th year, Harlem, right? Why that brother sound like he was in an Othello play, right? Him, Toni Morrison, and Maya Angelou are from 3 distinct parts of America, and they all sound like they're from the same neighborhood. And it never occurred to me, even hearing him speak, that the entire time, again, you're talking about facts, but the truth is, what are the circumstances that necessitate that people affect a kind of talking and to get into, to demand a kind of respect, right? And so one of the ironies about like a Baldwin's affectation of speech is like, I've never heard someone say he sounds white. I've never heard him say you talk like a white man, right? It was like he understood the power of imagining a kind of voice that would get something listened to, but injecting within that voice all of the language that needed to be heard by people who probably wouldn't hear it if they didn't hear that voice.
Someone told me that how Baldwin learned that way of speaking was he was a big movie fan, and he would go to Bette Davis and Joan Crawford movies a lot when he was young, and he was imitating them. And then someone else told me that they actually used to teach it, the mid-Atlantic accent is what it's called, in schools, because it made Americans sound more sophisticated.
Right. What's just crazy, because when you think about what the mid-Atlantic is, it's the middle of the ocean. right? Like, so the irony of it is like,
where we were born,
right,
essentially.
right, right.
Yeah.
So on your subject, like when you encounter Baldwin's work, what was for you? How would you describe that first encounter with his imagination? What novel, what short story, what work was it, and then how did it shape you as a fiction writer?
I actually discovered Baldwin's nonfiction first.
Okay.
I was a freshman at Brooklyn College and taking a class called People, Power, and Politics, a core 3. Brooklyn College has an excellent core program, or used to anyway. And no, they like cut it down because students complained that they didn't want to take geology if they were an English major and stuff like that. But I think I found it just completely enthralling. But so I come across this essay that we're assigned to read called "Here Be Dragons," which he wrote in like '85. So it's one of his later essays. And I knew nothing about James Baldwin. I heard the name. I had no idea what he looked like, where he lived, what he did. I knew he was a writer, and that was it. And I assumed that he was white.
That's what they want you to think, brother.
Because, you know, no, but that is what they want you to think, brother, because whenever and here's how pernicious and insidious white supremacy is. Anything that I ever heard about James Baldwin was always about his intelligence, and I assumed he was white because those two words, this country tells us those two words go together. Mm-hmm. Black and intellect don't really go together. But that's an aside. So I read this work, Here Be Dragons, and I'm floored and stunned by the level of intelligence, the amount of truth. It's almost overwhelming. So I said, it was also very transformative because this particular essay dealt with American queerphobia and what the root of it, Baldwin believes it is. And everything he was saying resonated so deeply with me that I said, I have to read every single thing by this man that I can get my hands on. And the first fiction I read as a result of that, because I wanted to start at the beginning, was Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is my favorite novel of all time. It is absolutely hands down my favorite novel of all time because Baldwin tells this story of this young man, John, who is the son of a preacher, who is on his way of to becoming a child preacher in a church that he's already beginning to see the duplicity of. He's already beginning to question what faith is based on the performances of the people that call themselves holy. And there's also a budding queerness where inside the church, he's beginning to realize that this queerness, this thing, this feeling that he has is not really as foreign to the church as one would believe. And he does so in language that is just so incredibly beautiful. There's a section of the book called The Thrashing Floor, toward the end of the book, where Baldwin is describing catching the Holy Ghost and speaking in tongues, glossolalia. And it is just so, he takes the English language, which is limited, and he breaks it open so that it could describe to the reader what it is like to be this person who is being inhabited by something divine. And it is the most beautiful and terrifying passage I have ever read in my life. And it taught me not just the power of descriptive imagination, but the power of words and how no matter how limiting words may be, you can find a way to make them say the thing you need to say. And that is the gift of a writer.
I like that. I like that. For me, in terms of like engaging with the fiction, and this is something anybody who reads in reading a lot of nonfiction first, and then reading the fiction, the thing that I think I recognize, and this is just my own assessment, was like the essays talked more, I imagine, to a white reader. And what I mean by that is like if you look at how Baldwin uses his pronouns, and when he describes black people, he says black people third person, he says they. When he talks about white people, he says they. The only time he uses the the first person, like first person plural, we, when he describes himself as an American, as an artist, and as a human being. And so, to your point, even as James Baldwin, if you just see James Baldwin, we don't have Instagram, and so it's like you see James Baldwin, Anglo name, nothing you would think second of, and then you read the essays like, oh, this is just a writer, right? Which is like raceless, which then becomes synonymous with white. What became evident to me in reading the fiction was there was a lot more of a rendering in language the internal circumstances of his black characters. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the essays, it was a lot about helping a white reader understand black people, which was a lot of translation. To me, like one of my favorite pieces is Going to Meet the Man, the story collection. And there's this like scene at the end of Previous Condition. It's just short story. I think about this like musician who was like navigating like a really difficult upbringing, and the way he describes the interior life of that character, it's like there was a freedom I got to see in his fiction that made me think, and this is what made me want to become an editor, was like I began to become curious, right? I began to think and ask questions of, I wonder what his first drafts looked like before he sent them to an editor. Okay. Like, did his essay say we, aligning himself with black people, and his editor said, no, let's take a place of neutrality. Let's take a place of objectivity. And so as an editor, I wanted to be able to, I sort of see myself as being able to protect that imagination, right? Like, because so much of the real stakes for you and for other fiction writers is like, you have to think about how much is the integrity of your imagination worth, right? So if you can get a book deal by making certain kinds of edits, do you make them? And at whose expense do you make those edits, right? And then when you make those edits, who then becomes written out of the imagining, and then what worlds are constructed? And I'm saying this to set up, one of the stories I love the most about the integrity of the imagination is the story you tell about the prophets and how you preserve that integrity. Are you at liberty to share that story?
Oh, sure.
Okay, I learned that setup question from, Johnny Carson.
So when I first got my literary agent and we went out to shop the prophets, it was going through this process called auction, which means that there are several publishers who are interested in publishing it, and they are going to bid on who gets to publish. So I thought, this is my first novel. I had no idea about the industry. The highest bidder wins. I thought that's how it works. The highest bidder in my case wanted me to make some fundamental changes to the prophets such that...
Are you going to describe what it was?
So, they thought the book needed a white savior. Because they didn't think that, this is how poorly they think of white audiences. They think that white people are so self-absorbed, egocentric, narcissistic, that they can't buy into a story unless there is some one good white character that they could hold on to redeem themselves of whatever they think their own sins are. This is not just literature, this is TV, film, so on and so forth, where they come at you and they were like, you remember the story of Issa Rae? We love Insecure, just make the lead actress white. So that is their frame of mind, that this is what white people want. They cannot empathize with anybody outside of the construction of whiteness. Mm-hmm. So this publisher said, we would like you to add a white savior to this novel, and here is a 7-figure sum. I said, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. So the next highest bid was quite lower than that, and I said, we going with them. And my agent's like, you sure? And some of my friends are like, "You sure?" And I'm like, "Oh, my integrity cannot be bought. Y'all bought and sold my ancestors. You think I'm gonna let you buy and sell me? No, ma'am. No, sir."
We like that. We like that. And something every time I tell that story as a parable, I always frame it. I reframe it that you didn't take less. You took what it was worth, because when we talk about it as taking less,
Indeed.
we see it as, oh, I'm losing something in that exchange. And so as an editor, and this is the hard part of like being an editor that works on the side of corporate interest, but at the same time wanting to protect that integrity. And the irony, right? Your book is still best-selling. Your book is a bestseller. It's in mad, languages. Every time I call you, you got a background with all the translations, the slight flex in the back, and it was a National Book Award finalist. And part of why I bring that story up is because of your books like yours that showed somebody I'm gonna like low-key embarrassed. Deisha Filial's here, who wrote Secret Lives of Church Ladies. But the reason why I'm going to bring her up is because you need those frames of reference that the imagination is going to get exactly what it deserves if you protect it, if you defend it, if you fight for it. And so, my first acquisition was Temple Folk, about Black Muslims living in America. Thank you. And because of a book like yours, and because of a book like, Secret Lives of Church Ladies, Aliyah Bilal, I was like, oh, I don't have to compromise the integrity of this, because I know what a success like this can look like. And what becomes hard for models of success is when not only do you have limited frameworks for it, but you have a limited framework of it. You think there's the only way I can get any of what I think I want is by taking that 1.1, right? So it doesn't even occur to you that there's another deal. You talk about it as if it's only that one deal or no book, right? And so as an editor, what I try to frame for writers is you have to think about what you have to imagine the reader on the other side. And what's so very difficult for writers is when you're writing in workshop and then you're writing to you're going back and forth with your agent and your editor, you start to believe that the person you're in direct conversation with is the person you're writing to. And then it becomes hard to imagine the person beyond what feels like the gate that's telling you, we got to get a white character in this book.
And this was my first time at it. I didn't know how that might alter the trajectory of my career, if that would be it in terms of my ability to be published. But I also had this gut, and I always tell people your gut is your God, that said it would be better sitting on the shelf for only you and your closest family and friends to read than you having to not be able to sleep at night because you sold your soul.
Yeah, yeah. So here's a question for you. What enables you to protect that, right? Because as much as we talk about integrity, right? Like you said, some friends is like, you could have took the bag. Like, you could have took the bag, right? It's easy I won't say it's easy. When those circumstances, when you're not the one in front of that, that 7-figure, it's easy to be like, oh, I would never. But then when you see that number, you like, well, there's a house I wanted. Like, you start reframing the way you think about it. What do you think enabled you to be able to look at that number and see something else?
Well, I'm not even gonna hold you. There was a house that I wanted in Prospect Park South, those beautiful colonial homes.
Oh, you was gonna move out of Bed-Stuy. You was gonna make the whole change. Just like
but that's not the stock I come from. I always tell the story of my great aunts who were from South Carolina, Dillon, in a little parish called Little Rock, who taught me how to shuck corn and snap peas and kill snakes when necessary when we were picking cucumbers out of the field, who walked around with razor blades in their cheek because they told me, you don't know what's liable to jump out at you, and they meant men too, and who did not need the protection of men, that were strong women on their own and didn't understand this, like modern feminism didn't make sense to them because they thought, why do I need a man to protect, provide, and do all this stuff for me. I'll do that for me. That's for me. So these are the women that raised me.
Yeah.
And these were women with enormous integrity, who worshiped a God, but not the white Jesus that you see a lot of people, a lot of black Christians have up on their wall. They knew that God looked like them, and they worshiped that, and they still had some of the old words for knowing that. These are the women and the men, because my great grandfather Lawrence was what they would call a medicine man, but some people called him a witch. And he, who embodied both his masculine and feminine aspects, taught me a great deal about, first of all, accepting who you are, and also about not being able to be bought, because you have access to everything you need. You can't be sold. So these people laid the foundation for me. And I know that not everybody has that. And when you're in dire circumstances, I grew up in the projects of Brooklyn. Shout out to Marlboro Projects in South Brooklyn, and we ain't have shit. But I didn't know we didn't have shit until somebody else started saying, well, you wearing rejects, and you don't have Lee's and Latigra, and you don't got no Showtop Adidas and all this other kind of stuff. I didn't realize we were without anything. Yes, we were eating the same thing over and over again, corned beef from the can and rice, but I thought that's what everybody was doing. So if today you took away all of my accolades, whatever money I had, I can still survive because I know what that's like.
Right.
You will never be able to offer me, there's no carrot worth my spirit.
Right. That's with that. So something that we, Robert and I talked about, because it's, I know I come to a lot of these things, and one of the things that I take also personal, and we talked about it, it's like when you come to these panels or you come to these discussions and it feels like what is being talked about between two people can't be applied in your own lives. And so this is the set of the conversation where it's like, how do we turn what we're talking about into something that's practiced for you? Like, what does this mean for you in your own lives, whether you're a writer or whether you're not? Because for me, it's always important, and this is what I think Baldwin, the one of the quotes that lives with me with Baldwin is like, you can't change people, you have to invest people with the morale to change their situation for themselves. And so what I think you represent is that spirit of integrity and the spirit of protecting one's imagination at a high price, right? And when I say high price, what I mean is, in romanticizing what it means to protect one's integrity, we also don't talk about the demand on one's spirit, on one's energy, the romanticism that comes with, oh, you did this great thing. And it's like, I know Dave Chappelle has fallen from grace in different ways, but one thing he said that I heard the hurt in his voice, where he was like, people coming up to me saying, you're my hero because I stepped away from 50 million. He was like, I don't want to be your hero, I want to be rich. Right? And it's like, when you've made that decision and you have to live with that, and it's like, you can't pay a bill one day, you like, I should have probably took that 50. It's hard to live in the long term of what that is, long after people have decided to no one's kneeling no more. Colin Kaepernick still don't have a job, right? And it's like, those are the things we don't think about after. And so it's always important for me to demystify that narrative of integrity.
There's a toll.
Right, there's a toll. And thinking about Baldwin and his fiction, what I think I've seen, and you can talk about what you've seen in his fiction, is he wasn't able to write as much fiction as he was able to write essays. Because at the end of the day, his essays is what made the money.
Yes.
If you look at the sales, Fire Next Time is his best-selling book, and that's not
far.
Right? But then you look at the legacy of a Toni. Toni has essay collections, right? She has, Playing in the Dark, The White Literary Imagination. It was a national bestseller. But when you think about her legacy, you think about the imagination first, right? And so you think about what a Baldwin is able to do to create that space where somebody can literally create an international legacy on their imagination, to the point where people are surprised that a Toni has essays. But in the inverse, it's like the way that Baldwin's legacy is imagined, I found myself just thinking, what if he did not have to, in a lot of ways, pay. How many more novels do we get? How many more collections do we get? Right? Does he ever decide to write essays? Because not who are those essays for, and it's like he was really like good at slipping in things to us, but it's like that kind of labor that he had to do was the labor that fed when he was able to write like a Go Tell It on a Mountain or Just Above My Head.
And keep in mind, he had to leave the country to do it, because he said he was going to die here. And part of why maybe his nonfiction is so revered and his fiction is not, not looked down on, but not given the prominence that I think it deserves, is partly because he realized, or he thought anyway, I can't sit around in an ivory tower cultivating my talent. I got to be out on these streets because look what's happening to my people, and so I got to be a witness to what I'm seeing,
right?
Which is, and he did so with his nonfiction, but so overlooked is the work, the imaginative work he's doing in the fiction.
Yeah.
I'm thinking now about Giovanni's Room, which doesn't have any black characters in it at all. It's about two white men. But what Baldwin sneakily does is that whatever the pathologies that are being explored about self-hatred and homophobia and all of these other things, this disgust for femininity in men and all of this stuff, these are coming from white constructs because Baldwin must have understood that prior to colonialism, Africa was a place of wide possibilities in terms of gender identity, sex and sexuality, and that we only became queerphobic and homophobic and all of these things once we were introduced to the religions of Europe and of Asia, because it's both Christianity and Islam where these deep pathologies around queerness and transness come from. So when asked about it, he said, I'm already talking about homosexuality. I didn't want to make them black too. That's just an extra burden. And what I have trouble with that, but I understand,
right.
He's writing this book in 1950 something.
Right.
But in hindsight, I think that was actually the best choice.
Right.
Because it doesn't add another pathology on top of black people, because the running gag in this country is that black people are the most homophobic, but it's really white people making all these laws trying to outlaw being trans, like to make that illegal to be who you are, So kudos to Baldwin.
In summation, no. So. And the thing I want to come back to again is like what you're talking about in terms of like the demystifying the romanticism is like this. He also was the youngest of 9, right?
He's the oldest.
The oldest of 9. My bad. Paul is the youngest. He's the oldest of 9, and so there's also a real like he has to pay. He has to take care of people.
Of 8
right?
other children. Yes.
And so there's also the reality that like as I'm having this conversation, the thing I always I try to talk to writers about a lot. Is like there are also certain kinds of calculations you're making where that million makes sense, right? And it's like it's easy to isolate fact from truth. You took $1 million to put a white character in. The truth of it is whatever circumstances that allowed you to see that money a little bit differently and go, no, I have 8 siblings and my father's dead, and who else is taking care? Like who else is even in a position to get that kind of opportunity.
Right.
And so I say this to say that like, something that I have been just thinking about in terms of legacies is like, what does it mean to understand the subtext as part of the text, right? What are the circumstances? And this is what like I've learned being on the other side of that table is like, there are so many other kinds of conversations that inform the art that we get, that when we call it lack of imagination, or this person didn't do this, or this person could have done that, it's like, do you know how hard they had to fight to even get it to a Giovanni's Room? So you can be, as a reader, disappointed, mad about a white, like the characters aren't black, but then also it's like, does that book get to exist that enabled to produce the next work? right?
Did you read Moonrise Over New Jessup?
Oh, yes.
Oh, that book was a battle. And that book loves black people so relentlessly that you know it had to be a battle to get on the shelves.
Right.
One of my favorite books.
Yeah.
Shout out to Jamila Minix.
Yeah. We're selling a lot of books tonight. I hope your registers are open. But so like this, and these are the things that, and this is what I would like, I'm going to frame this up to you, but the thing in terms of people who buy and read books, we don't engage with the price to make it, right? We don't
even know.
We deal with the cost, like the price it cost us. It's like, ooh, that's $27.
Right.
Right? And I'm not saying that $27, and I say this a lot to people, $27 is a dinner. As you know, it's like a third of a Wi-Fi bill, depending on how much you're surfing, right? Like $27 is real capital that makes you think second about, ooh, like that's one book. Netflix is 20, I got 1,000 movies, right? Like there's different kinds of calculations, but the reason why I wanted to frame that here for people in this room is that when you buy fiction, you're investing in imagination. You're investing in curiosity. And when we talk about these conversations in publishing, I'm at these tables all the time about, oh, this book doesn't sell. These people don't read. It's all a way of saying these imaginations are not valuable. So when these books don't sell, it's like, well, why would we invest in an imagination that we don't see to be valuable? And so when we talk about and laud these books that are doing and taking these kinds of risks, you know, part of what I wanted to frame here is about looking at the real, the tangible, sort of concrete, in some ways, risks that writers are taking because they're staking their lives, they're staking their livelihoods at the very least to put their imaginations forth. And so I would challenge everybody in the room that when you're engaging with fiction, when you see that word, a novel, when you see short stories, what you're engaging with is somebody's questions and interrogations for different kinds of possibility about the world. And when you're looking at the same amount of money, ask yourself, is investing in a different way of seeing things worth it? And if it is worth it, then it's money well spent, right? But if you only see it as, oh, this is another book, it's then very hard for you to make those calculations and understand the stakes of what it means to have access to these imaginations. We always talk about how so much of books help us see ourselves. But then what happens if those books don't exist? How much of yourself do you not get to see if there's not imaginations you're not engaging with, right?
And you and I know this part is difficult, but you should carry that grace when you read a black author and you think, why didn't this author make this choice or this thing? Because like as you say, some of these authors, I had the benefit of, I don't have any children. I already had 2 degrees when my book was published. I was in a decent enough position where I could turn down money. And some people are just not, like you said, in that position. So they make that sacrifice hoping that with the next book, because they earned some cachet or what have you, they can get to say what they actually want to say. And sometimes that works out and sometimes
it doesn't. But what makes it hard is like when you don't know the stakes of those battles, you just think, oh, this person sold out.
Yes.
As opposed to like it takes.
Not every black person is Clarence Thomas.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I did not know that.
He's in a league all by himself. Like,
and that's
no sanctuary,
and
no
you know what's wild is that when we look at Baldwin's legacy, it's almost like every black writer has gone through the moment when they're like, oh, you're not black enough. Like Baldwin was like, oh, this ain't. When he wrote Giovanni's Room, he got the "you not a part of us" thing. And to think in retrospect how absurd that is, but this is what I think about is like, who do we do that to now, right? That 50 years from now, it's like, oh, that book was great. And it's like, y'all hated that fucking book when it came out, right? Zora Neale Hurston died broke, sick, unmarked grave. And it took Alice,
God, what they put Zora Neale Hurston through, like they accused her of being a child molester. They said she was a traitor to her people because she was sort of airing out dirty laundry. They put her through they accused her of plagiarism. They just anything to discredit her. And it took Alice Walker to go walking through the weeds to find her headstone, to bring her back. Put on
syllabus.
And suddenly we celebrate her like.
The same book. It's the same text. It's like there's no revisions. It's like, It's the same book, so it says a lot about how we engage with text, right? So it's not the text itself.
And low key, they did the same thing to Wallace Thurman for talking about colorism.
Right.
In 1929, he wrote The Blacker the Berry, and they were pissed at him because he's a dark-skinned man saying, you know, y'all passing for white type blacks are doing all of these things that you really don't want me to tell the story, but I'm gonna tell this story.
Right. Right. And so like on the subject, on the subject of that is like,
We should go to questions too.
yeah, I'm looking at the time. You know, dial in now and donate your money. We're gonna take it to questions. I'm gonna just wrap this part up. Questions. Do y'all have them? Disha. And then you always gotta wait for that long microphone walk.
Thank you. Well, first, just thank you both for this conversation tonight. I have been fed. Okay, it's on. So I was fortunate to discover Baldwin when I was around 10 years old because he wrote the introduction to Daddy Was a Number Runner by Louise Merriweather. And I was like, oh, who is this man and what? You know, a lot of it went over my head, but I did like you. Like, I want to now read other things. And so that I found his fiction first, Go Tell It on the Mountain. But the book that sticks with me the most is If Beale Street Could Talk. And I know Go Tell It on the Mountain was a movie, but that one, I think the Beale Street movie had a higher profile. But I haven't been in every Baldwin conversation, obviously. But I don't feel like people talk about Beale Street the way that we talk about some of the others, and I wonder if either of you could speak to that.
Beale Street was one of those novels that told us about the how black people were regarded by the police before this moment that we're currently in.
Yeah.
And I'm not. You tell me what you think.
Okay.
I'm not sure if who Baldwin's talking to with that novel.
For me, okay. So the way and this is how I see his fiction is like I think he's talking to people who understand the emotional turmoil of not knowing, of having a suspended notion of what freedom looks like, when the notions of why you lost your freedom are happening from a system that you know is unjust, but you can't do anything about it, right? Like, so I would put If Beale Street Could Talk next to No Name in the Street to me, which is like that's his nonfiction, and the circumstance that sets up that essay collection. And the essay collection borrows his name from this notion of like he's famous writer who one of his friends gets locked up for a crime that wasn't proven that he committed or he didn't commit. And so the sister is like, "You're James Baldwin, get him out of jail." And he's like, "I don't have that kind of clout," right? And so by the end of the book, that friend is still in jail. He wrote this whole essay, you know, probably sold books, but can't get his friend out of prison. So the conundrum of being this world-renowned voice that people, you can stop on the street and you can't walk to the corner, but you also can't get your friend out of jail. Beale Street Can Talk felt like, what do the families who deal with that have to deal with?
And he makes the choice that we get this from the point of view of a black woman.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting for Baldwin's work.
And so the answer, like the way I just think about his fiction is like, even Sonny's Blues, the way that he builds that essay around this the brother who's addicted, like the protagonist is the teacher, but it's looking for his brother. But as that short story is working on you, you start to develop an empathy for why this brother is on drugs.
Yes.
So by the time you get into that jazz room and he plays, you see this, there's a beauty
you feel it
in this moment. Like I was watching Jungle Fever with my wife. She's black. I don't know why I felt like I needed to say that. Like I was just like, wait a minute, this feels like this is going. I just
have mercy. Have mercy.
But we were watching that movie and I was looking back and I was like, this is a terrible plot. But what I also saw is like the saving grace of that film is Samuel L. Jackson's performance as Gator. And there's a thread throughout that movie where Gator is always dancing. He's like, do the Gator dance. And something I thought about was like the fact that everybody knew that he danced. It was like what that movie really showed is like, this is what crack did, right? Somebody was a dancer before crack, right? And like what I think that Sonny's Blues did is it showed you a life
Before the heroin.
not even before heroin, right? Because there's something he said that some people use drugs because they can't take the world, and other people use drugs in order to engage with it. Like that's how unbearable the world is. And so when you're talking about creating narratives of empathy for somebody who's addicted, right, which is different than criminalizing, if you look at Sonny's Blues, that is a case for why we should not criminalize drug addiction, right? Like, and nobody would necessarily link that story or that, to that sort of outcome. But like when you see the end of that and his brother's like, oh, like he has a life that means something that's not based on my projections of what I think his life should look like. He has a life and I have to decide how I want to be around him versus like see him as a scourge on my life, right? And that's really what I thought that story collection was like that story did. But if you look at his fiction, so much of it was about the interior design of like our communities where we could not see the brother on drugs as anything but the brother on drugs. And that's to me like what his fiction to me spoke to Black readers. But the irony is like if you don't see fiction as a space where you can see yourself, you might not even have read his fiction. That's why we're galvanizing his fiction tonight.
Which is why the country is so invested in banning books, particularly fiction, because they know, Harvard did the study, that reading fiction increases your critical thinking and your empathy. Two things the government don't want you to have, because if you have those two things, what's going to happen in January would never have happened. Y'all ready for January, right? Get it together.
There was a question here, and I'm gonna come to you. There was you had
Yes.
a question with the mask and the glasses.
Thank you. Hi, good evening.
Hi.
Thank you both so much. I was able to attend the Centennial convening at the Schaumburg, so that just feels like a beautiful continuation. And I'm looking forward to the Mosaic Literary Festival coming up this weekend. But I wanted to speak to so much of the conversation tonight was about integrity. And as we go into the next 4 years of our, collective American life here, that feels like such an important thing to consider and then also embody wherever we can. So as you were talking, Mr. Jones, I thought about how much of integrity is thinking outside of the individual satisfaction and reward. And that is my question right now. Like, what would you say what is that demand for us to think outside of our individual reward? Because I think I'm a Nigerian immigrant, and often whenever I make decisions, I started to notice that I'd make decisions consciously and unconsciously thinking about how it ripples back to the people that I love.
Yes.
And I spend money thinking about the people that I love. Like everything is an act that somehow is not just for the people who are still alive, but also it ripples back to my dead. And that is a heavy weight to bear. Every decision is a heavy weight, but it is a good weight. And something that I've had to confront living in America is that individualism of all my decisions are for me, about me, to make me successful. So yeah, how much of confronting and shirking off that individual narrative and self-sufficiency narrative of the American culture would you say goes into developing and maintaining integrity?
It is absolutely crucial that when making every single decision, down to what I'm going to eat for breakfast, that I am considering those who are not having breakfast. Every time I purchase something from China or India or from the Gap or from Zara or wherever, to consider which child was forced to make this shirt that I'm wearing. I walk through the world with a tremendous sense of not guilt but shame, that I think it's called survivor's guilt, because it is, I wish I could do more. Like sometimes I feel like your gift is the word. You write, and that is how you. This is how you enable and you sort of do the work. But I sometimes feel like I need to do something more tangible. So I do things like I don't even want to say what I do because I don't want to be one of those kinds of people that's like, this is how I am a great person. But I consider that all the time. One of the things, you said you were a Nigerian immigrant. One of the things that I despise the most and one of the reasons why I left social media is the diaspora wars, where we have now, Black people have become segregated such that if you are from Nigeria or you are from Jamaica or you are from whatever, you are different than me from America. And it's fine to say we're not all the same because Blackness is not a monolith, but the thing that this diaspora war does is create a hierarchy. It says you are less than me as a result of not being from my tribe. And this, to me, is the point of social media. It is meant to divide and conquer, which is a strategy that has never not worked. And it's also a test case for how susceptible we are to suggestion. So I had to get away. As soon as I realized how social media was changing me, making me meaner, crueler, less patient, more aggravated and angry, I said, oh no, I got to get off of this. So I deleted all of my social media accounts and I'm never going back. I don't care what publisher thinks I should. But the key is, once I got off social media, it was so much easier to see the other person in the comment section or whatever as an actual person and not these digitized words that I could just screech at. And so it is vital, one of the vital ways in which the studies say children learn these things, compassion, empathy, critical thinking, is reading. Yeah. And the horrible statistics about children that can't read anymore. Did you see the illiteracy rate is skyrocketed, and the kids that can read don't want to read more than a paragraph because social media has shortened their attention spans.
And even at elite colleges, because you can make it a class thing, and even at elite colleges, professors can't even get students to finish a book, right? So in terms of just like seeing how that story ends,
unplug from the matrix.
Yeah, you can't even conceive problem solving because you're like, oh, I stopped in a novel because that's the problem. And it's like, the problem gets resolved like 75 pages later. It's like, it's too difficult. I want to address your question too. As you were talking, something I thought about, which is like deeply ironic, right? Like the people who tend to destroy the world. How do I want to say this? The people that tend to destroy the world never think that they're doing too much. They think that like what they're doing
is righteous.
And people who are doing things to make the world always feel like they're not doing enough.
Yes.
Right? And I listen to, in language, how people talk about their accomplishments. Oh, I only wrote 10 pages today. Oh, I only did this. Like there's this internalized narrative that what is being done because you haven't ended book banning in Alabama and you've never been to Alabama, but because you've never been to Alabama, your 10 pages ain't shit, excuse my language, right? And it's like, what happens psychologically is that person writes 5 and that person stops writing. And then that person says, well, I would have kept writing, but this. And something that, like, to your question about how we reframe that is the language around how we look at what we're doing, right? As opposed to what forces are fighting to keep that from happening, right? Because it says a lot that the way in which this war has happened, right? It has not been, and I think about this in the terms of the language of Trump, like one of the things that's always sat with me was when he was talking about Iran, and the first thing he said was, I'm going to bomb their libraries. And I'm like, that's a very specific, that's like not your hospitals, not your bases, like your libraries. Like I'm going to attack that first, and then to simultaneously live in a culture where 1 million books are published a year, just from major publishers, another 2 million from self-publishers, And then there's this, we have a high literacy rate. We have books being banned in places where those books are not getting access to. And then you meet that voice on the other end of the social media who doesn't have access, not only to the same truths, they don't even have access to the same facts because those very books are being banned. And then you can't see how this person doesn't understand something. But then you're like, oh, books are getting banned. What do you think is the ramifications of that? That person on the other end saying, I didn't know this happened. Right? And so like that challenge of integrity, like those little ways that, and I get catch myself, those ways that we engage, those ways that we keep the emotional valve open to connect, do not undermine that. Because that is why the book bans are happening. That is why so much is happening, because little things like that, and when I say little, what I'm saying is, in terms of scale, what it seems like is that nothing is being moved. But what fiction teaches us is like, there's this one character you identify with, and it's like this one character. Because you identify with this one character, your whole life is changed because you identified with one character in the novel. And it might be 20 characters, but you identified with that one. And the importance of the value of that is understanding when you got 20, you don't need to identify with all 20. But when we find those ones, we connect and we enlarge our hearts and our minds and our imagination. So like, I would just say to this room, like, no matter what it feels like we're up against, the work that we are set to do does not change, right? And if anything, what it becomes is more necessary to understand that the circumstances that we are up against make it harder for us to believe that the things we are doing matter. And so I'm like this, the thing that is important to me to say to everybody here is that those questions that go unanswered matter, not because they were unanswered, but because you asked them, right? And the whole work of fiction is not to have answers, but to have better questions. And so as long as we're a society that is unafraid or embraces the fear of asking questions that don't have answers, we can continue to imagine.
Amen. Ashe. More questions.
We have time for one more question.
One more question. Why did I say that again? I'm sorry.
Oh, somebody else had a question.
First, I want to thank you very much for your presentations. I just thought it was fabulous. Second of all, I grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and James Baldwin lived there while I was there. And he felt apparently very comfortable there because he didn't experience discrimination there. So I wondered if you would comment, or if you want to comment, on how he lived in Turkey and in France. It seems very significant to me that he lived in those two places and then that he came back during the Civil Rights Movement. So that's one of my questions. The other question is, the one biography I know of him is by David Leeming, who knew him in Turkey, who's white. So I was wondering if you have any comments about that.
About Baldwin's treks to France and Turkey. I don't know very much about his time in Turkey, other than he really enjoyed it. But in France, he said what he did was he needed to go someplace where he would be seen as black and not as a nigger. And found that in France he was seen as black and not as a nigger, more seen as an American. But he realized, but I am in another empire, and every empire has a nigger. So if it's not me, it's somebody else. And he found that it was the Algerians. The Algerians. So that didn't sit well in his spirit, that he was a witness to this new tragedy. In Turkey, I don't know a lot about his time in Turkey. I know that Turkey now has made some right turns, but I'm assuming while he was there that it was a much more accepting place, because here's this man that's like feminine in all of his energy, and also brilliant and black, and he was embraced. So.
This is a conversation.
Yes. And then in terms of how do I feel about the biography being written by someone white, There is an inside conversation and an outside conversation. And the people who are on the outside looking in can only see what the glass allows them to see, but the person that's in the room with you sees more. And that's what I'll say about that. Oh, he's outside. Yes. I believe there's another one, but I have not read it, and I'm not familiar with the author. But thank you for your question.
I want to end with a benediction by my brother, who's going to read something for us tonight from James Baldwin to set us off on our course this evening.
Okay, this is from
You got blue frames too? God damn.
This is from an essay by James Baldwin called On Language, Race, and the Black Writer. He read it also under the title We Hold the Trump at UC Berkeley in 1979, I believe it was, January 15th. And this speaks to the precipice we find ourselves on with the re-election of Donald Trump and him empowering rapists of every stripe in his cabinet. Most of us must be asking, what do we do now? And how do we survive this? Because, I heard someone say the next 4 years, but the Supreme Court made it such that he don't have to leave in the next 4 years, and this might be the end, the last presidential election in our lifetimes. So what do we do? And I turned to Baldwin, and here's what he said. The black people of this country stand in a very strange place, as do the white people of this country, and almost for the very same reason, though we approach it from different points of view. I suggest that what the rulers of this country don't know about the world which surrounds them is the price they pay for not knowing me. If they couldn't deal with my father, how are they going to deal with the people in the streets of Tehran? I could have told them if they had asked. There is a reason no one wants our children educated. When we attempt to do it ourselves, we find ourselves up against a vast machinery of racism, which infects the country's entire system of education. I know the machinery is vast, ruthless, cunning, and thinks of nothing, in fact, but itself, which means us, because we are a threat to the machinery. We have already lived through a slave rebellion. We cannot pick up guns because they've got the guns. We cannot hit those streets again because they're waiting for us. We have to do something else. Before each slave rebellion, there occurred something which I now call non-cooperation by the slaves. How to execute this in detail today is something each one of us has got to figure out. We could begin with the schools, by taking our children out of those schools, taking them off those buses. Everybody knows who thinks about it that you can't change a school without changing a neighborhood. You can't change a neighborhood without changing the city. And there ain't nobody prepared to change the city because they want the city to be white. America's cities are going to crumble when the white people move out to get away from the niggers. Every crisis in every city is caused by that. How can we expect people who cannot educate their own children to educate anybody else? This will be, well, contested. But black people hold the trump. When you try to slaughter people, you create a people with nothing to lose. And if I have nothing to lose, what are you going to do to me? In truth, we have one thing to lose, our children. Yet we have never lost them, and there is no reason for us to do it now. We hold the trump. I say it. Patience, and shuffle the cards.
You did that. That was good. That was good. That was good. That was good.
It worked.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yadon. Thank you, Robert. What a gorgeous conversation.
Where are we doing? Where are we going? Do we leave? What do we do?
Almost. Just almost. Actually,
Okay.
you're going to stay and
Okay.
you're going to have a cocktail, hopefully, with everybody here. Continue our conversation. Thank you all for being here as well. Thank you, Brooklyn.org. And let's continue this conversation
Hold on, wait.
in a more
you
informal
gonna
manner.
Give me this. Oh, wait, I have a mic.
Oh, yeah.
If you can afford to do it, and I mean that, buy a book. Because these institutions, and then there's an essay by Alice Walker when she writes about Zora Neale Hurston, and she said, "What does your work look like when you have to live on the kindness of strangers?" And this was like looking for Zora, like Zora Neale Hurston, a cautionary tale. And we talk about the ways in which our cultural institutions end up becoming compromised because they have to rely on dollars that have different interests than we would like. And so I say that to say, buy a book. Because those purchases change the way in which these cultural organizations can thrive and live. And when they don't have to take money they don't want to take, we get to keep the things like this going. So if you can, buy a book. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
I think
Thank you.
everybody could have sat there
Thank
for
you.
another 25 minutes.
Thank you. Absolutely.